Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Christine Caldwell. Christine is the founder of and professor emeritus in the Somatic counseling program at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, where she taught coursework in somatic counseling theory and skills, clinical neuroscience, research, and diversity issues. Her work began 40 years ago with studies in anthropology, dance therapy, body work, and gestalt therapy, and has developed into innovations in the field of body-centered psychotherapy. She calls her work the moving cycle. This system goes beyond the limitations of therapy and emphasizes lifelong personal and social evolution through trusting and following body states. The moving cycle spotlights natural play, early physical imprinting, bodily authority, and the transformational effect of fully sequenced movement processes. She has taught at the University of Maryland, George Washington University, Concordia, Seoul Women's University, Southwestern College, Pacifica, and Santa Barbara Graduate Institute, and trains, teaches, and lectures internationally. She has published over 30 articles and chapters, and her books include Getting Our Bodies Back, Getting in Touch, The Body and Depression, and Bodyfulness, which is her latest book and which we're going to talk a little bit about today. And I should also add that Christine is also a core faculty member of Embodied Philosophy's Mind-Body Therapy program, and we're very honored to have her and be collaborating with her on that project. So hello, Christine.
Hi, Jacob. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about this interesting topic of bodyfulness that you've written a beautiful book about that I've had the pleasure of reading over the past few days. And so just to get started, let's just jump right into it. I do want to talk a little bit about the story of, your life and your work, but let's start off with bodyfulness. So what is bodyfulness? And I know that you contrast it in your book with the concept of mindfulness, which obviously is very familiar to many people nowadays. It's an incredibly popular term, perhaps almost too popular.
Yes, exactly.
So what is bodyfulness, and why did you elect to choose that term over something, like mindfulness, for example?
Yeah, this is probably the central reason why I decided to try to popularize the word bodyfulness. I don't think I invented the word, but certainly this is the first book or article that's talking about it. And it started, as many things do with me, with a kind of irritation with the word mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And so, as you noted, the word mindfulness is very popular. It was really a big deal at my university. I was reading a lot of the research about mindfulness, which was very exciting and promising. But when I would delve into the research on mindfulness, what I noticed was from paper to paper or research study to research study, people were defining the word differently. Mm. And in some cases, quite differently. And they were also using body practices as a way to achieve mindfulness. And I thought, well, is it really, is being awake a mental phenomenon? And of course, for me, the answer came back, no, it's not. I mean, certainly mental phenomena are included in this, but it felt to me that the word was actually used inappropriately, and that really what was going on was something called bodyfulness. And I also wanted to create a kind of an extension from the word embodiment, because certainly in the somatic disciplines, the word embodiment is used quite a bit. And again, it's kind of a little bit muddy in terms of how people use it and what they mean by it. And as a geeky academic, I wanted to kind of get things a little more crisp and sort of play with the research on that. So I see embodiment as a state of opening up to the current lived experience of your body, so that there's a feeling of attentiveness to the body. And yet that feels like it's just a start. That's just a start, a beginning. And that the word bodyfulness can express more than just embodiment. So the word bodyfulness can really take us to the idea of what happens when you start with embodiment and then you look at it as both a physical, a psychological, but also a contemplative practice that goes beyond that, so that you're working in and through the body from a quality of not only awakeness, but of inquiry, and also a sense of non-judgmentalism and also non-analysis. So I get really interested, for instance, in a kind of wordless state of awakeness in the body that we don't have to translate into a verbal explanation for what we're doing, but just the lived experience of the body as it is, and not needing to kind of overlay this what sometimes is called a bullying effect of verbal language. Yeah. So that's a lot of where I wanted to play when I started writing the book Bodyfulness.
So that what you just remarked upon with the need to overlay, or the kind of compulsion or seeming command to or imperative to overlay one's experience with some sort of narrativizing. That makes me think of kind of more traditional therapeutic environments where it's like, okay, well, what are you feeling? Can you express that in words? I mean, in my own therapeutic experience, I remember many times where I was having feelings, but it felt almost oppressive to be told I needed to narrativize it or to explain it in some way. And so is that a little bit of what you're getting to? Is this kind of therapeutic method whereby the words aren't necessarily necessary, but what would be the alternative? If you're not speaking them, is it just about being present with them, or what is that about?
Yeah, this is a really important question. So one of the issues, and I've been a clinical neuroscience teacher for a long time, so I can talk about it in terms of particularly the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And a lot of what we know from a research perspective is really important in therapy is being able to go into the right hemisphere and kind of noodle around in there with images and sounds and emotions and memories and all that, and body states that are really more processed in the right hemisphere, whereas the left, of course, is interested in verbalization and creating a logical narrative, creating a coherent storyline, that kind of a thing. And for instance, people like Dan Siegel have talked about how the left hemisphere can bully the right hemisphere. And so it's the idea that we want to help someone be able to work with a right hemisphere dominant state and not feel that you have to exit the right hemisphere to create a narrative about it from the left hemisphere perspective. Because then what that does is it takes you out of that state, and this state where you can just be with your physical reality is so powerful. And so, but you're right to talk about how do you make that usable? How do you work with it? Because it's not enough just to hang out there. You have to know how to work with it, right? And so as a body-centered psychotherapist, that's on one level what I've spent my whole career doing, is really trying to find out how to help make these very direct nonverbal states useful for people in terms of healing, creativity, contemplative practice, etc. And so, I'd want to say, though, that it is important to talk about our experience. I don't want to get rid of talking about our experience because it's actually quite helpful and useful. What I'm really interested in doing is having an ability to postpone the verbal narrative long enough so that there's this rich experience, this rich direct experience that can sequence on its own. It can create its own, what I call body narrative. And so I'm looking for body narratives, coherent body narratives, before you start constructing a verbal narrative about that. And with the idea that you can't really talk about an experience that you haven't fully had. A lot of times we'll start to have, let's say, an emotional experience or a physical experience, and then we'll go, oh, this is about this. This is, and you plop on the verbal narrative, and then that closes it down. So we have to be able to really stay with the body narrative, the body experience long enough that this really rich material comes up that can be worked with directly. Mm. And so we do that a couple of different ways. And certainly, what I'll say now is not particularly new. In the body psychotherapy field and the dance therapy field, these ideas are pretty common. So I'm an integrator at this point to talk about it. But so one of the ways that we would work with that right hemisphere sort of direct experience of the body is to work with it in the relationship with, let's say, the therapist or the teacher or the artistic companion or the spiritual teacher. And so there's this, what we call a body-to-body relationship where the right hemisphere of, I'm going to say therapist, the right hemisphere of the therapist talks directly to the right hemisphere of the client. And so there's these wordless exchanges that happen between the two bodies that can be very powerfully healing. And in fact, a lot of research has been showing this, that a lot of the clinical importance of the therapeutic relationship is actually in these nonverbal state exchanges between therapist and client, but also between partners, between spouses and partners, particularly in long-term relationships. So the look on my face as you say something to me, or the look at the gesture that I put to my chest when you have a certain look on your face, or that your posture changes, those kinds of nonverbal communicative exchanges are our first language system and are very reparative and very creative. So that's one way of working with it. Another way is to, again, think of that the body has stories it wants to tell that could be potentially quite different than the verbal narrative that we've laid on top of it. And so a lot of times what we'll do is work with emotion or sensation or breath or movement to help the body find, in a sense, what it's really feeling, what it's feeling down below conscious awareness. And bringing up those states as movements, as sounds, as emotional expressions, without the need for words is very, very powerful and very healing, very creative.
Mm. So. Is that partly because, the words can sometimes end up becoming a kind of defense mechanism that is actually evading what we're really experiencing?
Yes, exactly. A lot of times the verbal narratives are stories that we've been taught to tell about ourselves, or stories that we've heard from others, that we've absorbed. And certainly that's true on the body level too. Our body absorbs culture and reflects culture as well. Yeah. But the verbal overlay is oftentimes, Freud actually talked about it, about rationalization and defense mechanisms and all these projections. And he actually created a really nice list of ways in which you can verbally fool yourself and actually create a kind of alternate reality that doesn't work for you. Yeah. And so this idea is that you find this kind of bodily truth that then can reorient your life so that you're living a more true experience of yourself.
Amazing. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of bodyfulness. And in your book, you outline 8 principles of bodyfulness. So let's just maybe move very briefly through them. So the first one is oscillation. Do you want to talk a little bit about oscillation?
Yeah, this is one of my faves, my personal faves.
That's why it's first.
And probably, there you go. Probably because I'm a physics and biology geek. So the principle that you can see both in physics and biology, but let's take biology, is that all life oscillates. And so you can see it in our heart beating, our gut with peristalsis, our lungs with breathing, our brains with waving. The body is always oscillating. Some older body psychotherapists called it vibrating or pulsating. But sort of from a biological standpoint, it might be called oscillation. So there's always a lot of very physical oscillations going on in the body. And what I get really interested in is creating systems of work that actually leverage what's happening in the biological processes. And so when we look at then how, since the body is oscillating all the time, how can we cooperate with that? How can we do it consciously so that we can learn about really basic phenomena that are stored in our breathing, our heartbeat, our gut, our brains, and really allow those experiences, those oscillatory experiences, to increase a kind of coherence in our bodies and create. Well, for instance, in the brain, oscillations are really information carriers. So by really paying attention to any number of oscillatory phenomenon, we can really play in a real sophisticated way.
So what would be an example of, or what would perhaps be a symptom of not aligning with this sort of oscillatory aspect of our bodies?
Well, a good one would be what happens to your breathing when you're anxious. And so when you're in a state of anxiety, you have a tendency to over inhale and not exhale enough. And so you're unbalancing that particular oscillation. And so you're going, and you're sucking in a lot of oxygen. And what happens then is your brain reads that you have too much oxygen, and then you start to actually panic because your blood gases are out of balance. And so a lot of times people actually make anxiety worse by unbalancing their breathing, and then their body gets alarmed, and then that's where panic attacks can possibly get started. So that's a good sort of crisp example, but it's on an emotional level as well as a physical one.
Okay. So second principle is of balance, which seems pretty self-explanatory, but do you want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, well, yes, it is. And what I like about this word is that you can look at it at a lot of different levels. And so just on the basic physics of the body, the basic biology of the body, we are standing on 2 legs, and we are always, when we're in the vertical, we're always balancing. We're always contracting flexor muscles and then extender muscles, and then flex, extend, in order to keep ourselves upright. And so there's this idea of also, I was watching this one day because as I get into my late 60s, I've been, you get all these exercises for seniors, and a lot of them are about balance. And a lot of them are literally, how long can you stand on one leg? How much can you go off balance and find your balance again. Of course, they're trying to prevent falls, but this principle is really interesting. And so we take the kind of literal physical idea of balance, and how does the body always renegotiate balance as you're moving around, as you're, doing whatever in whatever relationship to gravity. And how does that physical balancing affect and relate to things like emotional balance? So the ability to feel that you can find a kind of equanimity in your emotional states because you're allowing yourself to say, okay, yes, I feel a little frightened. And if I oscillate out, I can see that I'm okay. But yes, I'm a little frightened. And if I oscillate back out, I can see I'm okay. And so a lot of times, for instance, in therapy, particularly, let's say, trauma-based therapy, one of the ideas is that you have one foot in the past and one foot in the present. Because in the past is where something got started, and in the present is where your safety and resources are. Mm-hmm. And so you balance yourself across the past and the present. Yeah. You balance yourself into feeling a feeling, but not letting the feeling take you away, get you out of balance. Yeah. So we see again the physical concept of balance relates to balance on lots of other levels: emotional, cognitive, contemplative.
I love that one about balance in time, because we can totally see individuals in our lives, or we ourselves at certain points, being sort of imbalanced in the past, or conversely imbalanced into the future. It's sort of like you're never truly being present because you're always running towards the next thing, or you're stuck in a memory that you have. So that's I feel like that's such a useful tool.
Yeah, really good point.
So feedback loops is number 3. What's this one about?
Yeah, this is the idea that the physical body, again, is highly networked to the point where it is perhaps useful but not accurate to talk about different systems of the body that do different things, or different types of cells that do different things. One of the other realities, there is these distinctions in the body in terms of, yes, there's a respiratory system, and yes, there's a digestive system. But the reality is that these systems are not independent. They're highly interdependent, and they're always talking to each other. So, for instance, again, Dan Siegel has popularized this idea of what he calls neural integration. So that's how he defines, in a sense, health, or mental health particularly, as the idea that it's not how many neurons you have, or not as much about who's talking the loudest, but are they talking to each other? And what we see is that health and well-being could be defined as this state of how well the different systems of the body talk to each other and mutually influence each other. So when the digestive system and the nervous system are really exchanging a lot of real-time data, you actually can regulate yourself much better than if that's not occurring. And certainly you see this principle a lot in psychotherapy, where, like in Gestalt therapy, they talk about fragmented parts of the self that aren't talking to each other, and that you're trying to re-own fragmented parts of the selves. And what that really means from that perspective is that it's integrated. The experience of one part of you is integrated into the experience of other parts of you. And probably one of our best examples of that is what we call the sensory motor loop. So sensation goes into the central nervous system, it gets processed in the central nervous system, and then it comes out as some kind of motor response, or an action, or a movement of some kind. And the it creates a kind of continuous feedback loop so that the motion of our bodies in reaction to sensation always informs the next sensations that occur that then do that. And so we see some really hefty feedback loops going on. That's one of them. There's also what's called a viscerolimbic feedback loop, which is from the gut to the kind of mid centers of the brain, a lot of where emotions occur, for instance, and memories occur. So we see a huge hookup between the gut and the middle parts of the brain, particularly the emotion and memory centers of the brain, so much so that we're actually calling the gut our second brain at this point. So very cool stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know you've talked about this a little bit with that one, but what are some or one or two other ways that you can, because I feel like from one perspective, these things are just happening in a certain sense, but then we're also obviously talking about ways in which we can participate in the feedback looping process, for lack of a better term. So what would one or two of those ways of participating be?
Yeah, well, if we take the sensory motor feedback loop, we can see that if we enrich sensation, then we give the central nervous system more to work with so that it can then generate a motoric response that's more sophisticated and more really finely tuned to what is actually happening. And then that more finely tuned motoric response can enrich our sensory experience. And so a lot of what we do in bodyfulness is to wake up to what's already happening even more in more enriched detail so that we can allow the information processing to be more enriched and strengthened also, so that it goes back to that neural integration idea that whatever you keep doing gets easier. And so we can live more consciously our various integration feedback loops.
Right, I see. Okay, so number 4 of our 8 principles is energy conservation.
Yeah.
So tell me about
this.
This
is a big one. Yeah, this is a big one. And one that doesn't get talked about a lot in, for instance, body psychotherapy or dance therapy. It's the idea that we see in all of the systems of the body that, and it's in a sense, it's very Darwinian. You want to be able to expend the least amount of energy to get done what you need to do. And that's on a kind of organism level, like I don't want to run to something that I can walk to, because if I expend so much energy, then I don't have it left over for something else I might need to do. That's the kind of historical Darwinian idea, is that for most of our evolution, we've had to conserve energy very powerfully in order to survive. Of course, that principle gets a little hinky in modern day when we see that we're dealing with overabundances in some cases, like an overabundance of food or something like that. But but you see this in all the systems of the body that, for instance, the brain is very an energy hog. It's like 5% of our body weight, and it takes 25% of our calories.
Wow.
Or 25%, yeah. And so the central nervous system is always looking for ways to conserve energy. And so it tries to shut things off while it's doing something that's expensive. So, for instance, consciousness is actually quite metabolically expensive. It takes a lot more energy to be awake than it does to be asleep. And I think that's a political statement, by the way. I really think that from a sense of what we need to do to wake up to political realities is not take easy routes, just really energy conservation, simple answers on a social level and a relational level. But we could talk about that another time, maybe.
No, I like that.
But,
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, okay. So, but for instance, consciousness takes a lot of energy. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to sleep, is we need to conserve energy. But also, if we have to pay attention to something that, let's say, is a potential danger, what happens is our central nervous system really gears up, sends a lot of resources like oxygen and blood up into the central nervous system, which then shunts a lot of resources to defending ourselves, like blood to our face or our upper body to fight, or blood to our lower body to flee. But what it has to do in order to do all that good stuff is it has to turn things off. So it will turn off digestion, it'll turn off reproductive processes, and it'll turn off the immune system. So this is why stress makes you sick. This is why trauma makes you physically sick, because of this energy conservation. And so if you chronically are feeling frightened and that you need to defend yourself, you are chronically turning off your immune system, your digestive system, and your reproductive system, and to the peril of your physical health over time.
Wow.
And so energy conservation is important. We need to do it, but we want to be able to watch out for the cost of that and be very sort of judicious about how we do energy conservation.
So it's probably safe to say that in our kind of sped up, hyper, vigilant in terms of, energy expending culture, that there is probably a lot of this going on, right? Shutting off of various systems.
Yes. And I believe also that this hypervigilance and hyperarousal of modern developed country living is also at least a partial explanation for why we have a tendency then to sort of take the opposite extreme and become couch potatoes, become sort of fall into our cell phones, fall into just watching TV, fall into a kind of overly sedentary lifestyle because it's trying to find a balance. And it would be nice if we could fill out the middle of that particular continuum.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, even myself, I know in times in my life when, especially when I'm working really hard, it happens, for a certain period of time. And then it's like, okay, one day I literally can do nothing but sit on the couch and watch endless episodes of Netflix.
There you go. There you go. Exactly. And I think we've all been there and done that.
Yeah. And not to say there's anything wrong with that. I mean,
that's right.
You're doing it right.
Well, again, it's a balance, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So number 5, we're halfway through now. We are on now discipline, which of course, as you even mentioned in your book, people can be like, oh, discipline, that sounds kind of scary and arcane. Mm-hmm. So what does this mean, and how does this play into this concept of bodyfulness?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to resurrect this word, particularly in the psychotherapy context, because I think we probably don't appreciate this enough in psychotherapeutic contexts. So it's a well understood word in different contemplative and religious practices. Every major religion, really, I would think any religion, has some sense of practices that require discipline, and a lot of times that has to do with a commitment to exercising, literally a commitment to exercising, whether you're exercising your ability to pay attention in certain ways, like in meditation, or your ability to be with certain emotional or contemplative states. This is the same understanding of discipline, let's say, that athletes have, that you have to athleticize the muscles of your body, your cardiovascular system, et cetera. And, I'll invoke again all the stuff from AARP that I'm getting about being a senior. They talk about use it or lose it. And so this idea of discipline is actually really crucial. And you can see that over and over again in the body, that the body requires certain disciplines in order to maintain health and well-being. And so I really want to make sure that we don't feel that this is a pejorative, that discipline isn't part of the process. And particularly to kind of disentangle it from the idea of being disciplined, as in talking about punishment or anything like that. Yeah. I think it's very important to disentangle that and really look at it very carefully from a physical level of how happy the body gets when it has different disciplined practices that it engages in.
Yeah, so do you think that part of the resistance to this, or the discomfort that perhaps some people have with this in terms of, I'll use the word medical environment in a very broad sense, is because we've been kind of enculturated to this idea of the quick fix prescription, whether it be receiving a pill. So it's I'm a passive recipient of that which will heal me. You give me a pill, you give me the right therapeutic kind of, encounter, whatever the case may be. And I don't actually I don't have to take ownership in any sort of particular way of my own process. I'm just going to let you heal me.
Yes, I think this is a really important point you're making, and one of the downsides of modern Western culture. And in a sense, one of the results of modern Western culture, as you're saying this, is that it pacifies us. It literally creates a kind of passive relationship to what happens to me. And those of us who are psychotherapists know that when you feel that way on a psychological level, that the experience I'm having isn't under my control, that there's nothing I can do or not do that relates to it. All that happens to me has to come from outside of me, is given to me or happens to me. This is a prescription for mental illness. And so a lot of psychologists call it external locus of control. Like you said, that external thing is a pill, and I just passively take it. This is actually where I started to work with the concept of bodily authority. The idea that we claim a lot more authoritative knowledge of our body, then we can say, okay, I know best what my experience is, and I know best what I can do to take care of it and work with it and heal it or play with it. And I think this is really a critical way that we understand how modern Western society, that we have to have a lot of discipline to resist some of the forces that pacify us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, moving right along. Number 6 is change and challenge. So what is this about, Christine?
Yeah. Well, when I was first studying neuroscience, I got really interested in this, and that is back in the 1920s, a doctor named Edmund Jacobson was working with the nervous system. He was a medical doctor. And he noticed that the nervous system actually stops paying attention to things that recur and it only sharpens attention when things are novel. And so, something happens over here, and I go, "Oh, what's that?" That's a small example that the nervous system, again, trying to conserve energy, kind of gets quiet and goes on automatic when things are familiar and the same. And it only wakes up when there's some kind of change or novelty that occurs. This is probably why research is now showing that one of the ways to prevent or minimize cognitive decline in aging is by making sure that you have a lot of novelty in your life. And so they want you to learn new things, play Sudoku, learn how to tango, all this stuff. And that's because you have to keep the system working and active in order to keep the tone, the discipline, the balance, etc. And the only way to do that, or one of the best ways to do that, is with novelty. And so in the system of education, for instance, what they're finding is that people learn optimally in a state of mild discomfort. So this is really interesting. Yeah. This is also the whole idea of discipline again, which is that if you're comfortable, if you're sitting on the couch and you're comfortable, that's great. You want to be able to do that, but you're not learning anything at that point. It's not about learning anything. In order to learn something, you actually have to really gather yourself up, open up, pay attention, and really create that novelty. And so change, the basis of change is that we have to wake up and pay attention to something new or different that we weren't paying attention to before. This is actually Freud first, really. He didn't talk about it, but when you look at what he did as practices, what he developed as practices, it was always about this, about waking you up to something you weren't paying attention to before. And so this relationship between novelty and change is very, very powerful, and it helps to really centralize it so that we can leverage it as a contemplative practice, a therapeutic practice, an artistic practice.
Well, yeah, this seems like a really important point to me because, and I don't know if you agree with me, but it seems like, and this is sort of a political question, but one of the features I feel like of public discourse today a little bit is that people have become uncomfortable with discomfort in a certain sense. And so, many people, when they encounter someone whose position is different from theirs, rather than engage in the uncomfortable work of trying to tease it out and try to actually learn where the other person is coming from, the tendency is to kind of shut it out, delete the friend from Facebook, for example, and kind of isolate yourselves in a sort of echo chamber of thought that won't make you uncomfortable and will just further support and perpetuate your own kind of what you've decided is sort of the core of your identity when it comes to these ideas. So I don't know if that's something that connects with what we're talking about, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I actually really enthusiastically agree with you on this one. I think this is a really important point. And one of the ways we can look at it from a social context or a relational context is if you could see a kind of continuum. And over on this end of this extreme of the continuum, we call it conflict avoidance. We avoid conflict at all costs. And then we have to surround ourselves with people who only think the same, say the same, feel the same. And we don't then find the challenge that we need to grow and to be healthy, actually. And then on the other hand, you have conflict seeking. And so there are some people that actually try to stir up, like let's say if we're using the social environment, we could talk about conspiracy theories that are, and really dramatic, let's even say fake news. One of the functions of fake news is to generate a kind of an exciting conflict-seeking idea. Those jerks, they're
Yeah.
so blah blah. And it on either end of that spectrum, what you're doing is you're trying to make your life more simple. Your life gets either very uniformly gray over here or very black and white here.
Yeah.
Both of those are very simplistic locations. And so again, we're conserving energy, but we're doing it in a way that doesn't have any middle ground that you're talking about, where we're slightly uncomfortable. We're saying, could you tell me more about your political view? I don't get it. And you're tolerating something that creates discipline in you. It creates the integration. It creates the balance, etc. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, beautiful. I love the way you've just unpacked this idea in relation to all the things we're talking about. It's a really kind of sort of fresh way of looking at it. I love it. So
you.
now we're going into contrast through novelty, which is a little bit what we're speaking about. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. So again, the about 100-year-old idea is that we learn by contrast, and so we learn by the ability to create a kind of contrasting state to the one that we're in, which then wakes up just to use the central nervous system at this point, but it's true throughout the whole body, that the contrasting experience wakes us up and it opens us up also. So the brain becomes interested in, like, what's happening? Have I seen this before? Have I experienced this before? How I reacted to it work? So the brain gets real interested. And so the contrasting state really helps. This is also, by the way, true in the immune system. So the immune system works on this idea that, there's cells that are circulating, immune cells that are circulating around in the body all the time, that their only job is to say, oh, wait a minute, I don't know that one. What is that cell over there? Is it a friend or a foe? And should I get alarmed and call in the troops, or should I just ignore it? And so both chronic ignoring in the immune system and chronic calling in the troops in the immune system is a definition of immune system disorders. And so this idea of the contrast is really, again, it's powerfully in the body, and our biology sits underneath and creates the architecture for our psychology.
Yeah. Okay, so final one of the 8 principles of bodyfulness is associations and emotions. Will you tell us about that?
Yeah, if you'll forgive me for using another neuroscience reference here.
Oh, please.
The central nervous system is always comparing incoming sensation to what it may have experienced before. So an incoming sensation is actually routed to different locations in the brain, depending on whether or not we think we have experienced it before and what we did with it before. And this is all, by the way, unconscious. It happens before you're even aware that you are feeling a sensation. And so the sensation has already been kind of categorized before we ever wake up to it. So in the brain, we actually have several what are called association centers. And what we know is that the more association centers incoming data is sent to, the richer an experience we have. And so you'll see it sometimes when we are, let's say, sitting around, let's say, with your brother or your sister, and you're saying, oh, remember that time when we were 8 and 5 and you were wrestling with me in the living room and Dad yelled and I fell and hit my head, and then all of a sudden your sibling says something else, and then you talk about the quality of the light in the room, or that your dad was making a cake and your cake fell, or you're filling it out because your brain wants to pull in different things, and the richness of that experience is very important for neural integration. And it's very important also to allow us to have rich emotional lives. And so we can remember something and feel, again, the feelings of it, and to call up those feelings into the present body is a very powerful and stabilizing experience. It's why we like to have memories and share memories. And so the process of association is actually really common in different psychotherapy fields. So, for instance, I would ask a client what they're noticing, and the client would say, well, I notice my throat is tight. And then I would say, just stay with that for a minute. Just pay attention to it. What comes up when you notice your tight throat? And they would say, well, I hear a sound of like, or I see an image of a hand choking, or I start to feel frightened. Those are all associative processes, and they're how good psychotherapy begins, because you want to really work with those different associations. They're different for everybody. And you bring them up and you work with them because, again, that helps you become more right hemisphere dominant. It pulls in resources from that half of your brain and allows you to work with a lot of different creative and reparative states.
Excellent. Okay, so just to kind of review the 8 before we move on, they were oscillation, balance, feedback loops, energy conservation, discipline, change and challenge, contrast through novelty, and associations and emotions. And of course, there's much, much more in Christine's book, which all of you listening can get on Amazon. And so now, we've been talking about this, Christine, and I just want to touch on them very briefly, which are the 4 aspects to the practice of bodyfulness. Obviously, like I said, I think they've all been coming up in various ways throughout as we've been unpacking the 8 principles. But I just want to touch on them or give you an opportunity to just touch on them briefly. And they are breathing, sensing, moving, and relating. So do you want to talk a little bit about these before we move into some more political questions?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll make it quick then, because the politics is the fun part, right? It can be, at least.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I get really interested in is that biology underlies and supports our psychology. It creates the architecture for it. And breathing has always been known to be not only physically significant. If you don't do it after about 5 minutes, you die. That's very significant physically. But people have always realized that it's emotionally significant, that when we hold our breath, we start to feel differently than if we breathe deeply into an emotional experience, for instance. Breath work is used a lot to help regulate arousal and emotional experience, so that the emotion is felt and held, but it doesn't run away with you. And of course, breathing practices are used in any major contemplative tradition as a way to wake up and to work with contemplative states. And so breathing is pretty central as a discipline that we want to be able to have some relationship to. So in the book, I'm really telling people, there's a lot of different breathing practices out there. Find ones that work for you. Have different ones that work for you in different circumstances. Don't get, really rigid about just one. Really have a kind of a set that help you particularly also find different balance practices, because we see, for instance, the balance of inhale to exhale as being really critical. So breathing, very central. Moving, again, very central. We could also use the word expressing, because we see that, I feel something, and then it's actually important to express it from a psychological perspective. So the ability to express or to hold back an expression also is also very important. It keeps us safe. It also keeps us socially intelligent to, not yell at your boss kind of thing. Very good emotional intelligence. So the idea in that sensory motor loop that we talked about before is that we're always moving. We're always moving in response to our experience. And studying movement, allowing movement to be a conscious practice is very critical because it is so critical to our physical nature. The definition of life is movement, the beating heart, the waving brain, the pulsating lungs. And so movement is actually quite critical. So again, in the book, I really encourage all the readers to find some different movement practices. Again, various ones that really feel good in different circumstances, from walking and hiking to yoga to my particular big movement practice is dance. I take dance classes all the time. That one really, that's home for me a lot. And so we all need, for bodyfulness, some kind of breathing practice, some kind of moving practice. And also we need a sensing practice. So the ability to turn my attention to sensations inside my body, but also sensations that are focused about the outside, my eyes and my ears, as well as my guts and things like that. So we want to have the ability to practice enriching sensation and being able to work with sensory processes, because this is the basic raw data that everything rests on. Is what's happening inside me, what's happening outside me, and then what do I do about it? And so having a rich sensory experience is really important. I remember reading a research study that once said that most people in developed countries only pay attention to their bodies under 3 circumstances: sex, exercise, and pain. Mm-hmm. And that's great. We like to do that in those 3 circumstances, but that's also a sort of an impoverished relationship to our body to only pay attention to under those 3 circumstances. Yeah. So in order for bodyfulness to occur, we need to really expand out of those 3. And the 4th is relating. So I believe that any contemplative practice, as well as therapeutic practice, needs the ability to work with how I relate to others, as well as how I relate to myself, but a lot of how I relate to others. We, for instance, now know that social intelligence is actually a greater predictor of a lot of life satisfaction, physical health, longevity, financial success. All kinds of things are related to our social intelligence. And the ability to relate to others, which is in danger of being lost in our highly technological world, is really critical. And so I actually think that it's not enough, for instance, to just sit on the cushion and meditate. It's actually not enough just to do a yoga pose. It's actually important that we get off the mat and relate and understand that there are relational practices that are also really critical for our well-being and for the well-being of society. So to find relational practices as well is part of bodyfulness.
Beautiful. All right, so I want to shift for the last portion of our conversation, which has been amazing thus far. I want to shift in, not too crazy, but a couple more political questions. And one is this interesting comment you made in your book. You describe at one point that bodyfulness is activism at its most basic level. And so I just wanted to know what you meant by this, and if you could unpack that for us.
Yeah, so as I've always specialized in my career in movement and movement processes. And really, a movement is an action. And I get very interested in what's the relationship between the body's actions and what we understand as activism. And so activism means you're doing something about what you see and what you feel and what you believe and what you experience and what you want to change. Your activism is I commit to doing something. And so the idea of what do I do comes up a lot for all of us about what do I do with particularly potentially very overwhelming large issues, let's say like climate emergency. And so this idea of how do I understand that I'm not just moving for myself to, get dressed in the morning and take a walk, but I'm also moving in ways that contribute to the resolution of climate emergencies or the resolution of political political events that I feel alarmed about. Mm-hmm. And so activism is oftentimes a tricky issue, and there are people that do their activism in ways that might not work for their own bodies, their own health and well-being, but also aren't effective in the world. And so we want to really understand activism in a very rich and nuanced and detailed way so that my body, the authority of my moving body, my very conscious, awake, moving body, helps inform what kind of activism I do in the world. And I do believe that actually we are not in a state of well-being unless we are also social activists. And so I have a real complaint a lot of times about modern Western psychotherapy in that it's overly self-centered. It's centered on the self and the separate self and the self that is removed from social contexts. And we see that, in a sense, in the way that psychotherapy can be an actual oppressive force and to really reinforce social norms, unexamined biases, and social conditions that actually oppress people. And so it's important that we understand that our psychological well-being and social well-being is interrelated, it's interdependent, it's networked, and therefore we have to be social activists as well as personal activists, and that locates itself in our moving body from the beginning of our moving body.
Is it so part of it, I feel like, right, is this ability to trace, right, the impact of the social context on our experience of the body, and if it's not, what else is it besides that in terms of letting bodyfulness not be simply another way of just honing in on this compartmentalized thing, my embodiment, but actually something that is a sort of a locus of understanding these intersecting mechanisms.
Yeah, that's really well put, because the issue is that the action or the activism is bidirectional. And so it's very important for me to study the impact of different social forces on my body, how my body feels, how I experience it, how I narrate stories about it, and how I move my body is impacted by different social forces. And sometimes those forces are oppressive. And so a modern Western society tends to oppress the body in general. It tends to see it as a kind of lesser partner to the mind. The mind is pure and the body is weak and the body is dirty and all these things, and which probably just harkens back to our fear of death, because we know that the body dies. Mm-hmm. And so it's partly we want to understand how society impacts our moving body, our sensing body, our relating body. But what we also want to do is to see how that sort of understanding and development of our own bodily authority, that my body has rights, my body has dignity, my body, it has an authority that can be a social contribution. I have to start standing up for my body in society and resist forces that are trying to, as we said before, pacify it, make it just a consumer, and really understand what it means for me to also be a producer, lead a productive life. Yeah. And part of being productive, and not to be afraid of the word productive, is to produce social well-being by how I move with the different social forces. I don't know, a little esoteric.
No, that was very beautifully put, actually. Yeah, beautiful. So, you offered a somewhat of a critique of psychotherapy in terms of a lack of addressing the political component or the socio-political context. But do you have any thoughts on how an encounter with bodyfulness could potentially shift forms of activism? So maybe perhaps seeing some limitations in activism as it's expressed at this moment that could use a little bit of the insight of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think so. I think, let's say, if we go to some kind of a march or a public gathering in which we do encounter people who feel differently than we do, I think one of the first things we want to do is really do that encounter from a bodyful perspective. So the first thing is to sort of oscillate in and really get in touch with and hold my own bodily integrity. My body has a right to be here, to move the way it feels, that can keep it safe and express my experience that I have a right to have, but also that it can oscillate out and appreciate the physical rights and integrity and dignity of the bodies of people who feel differently than I do. Mm-hmm. And I think what that does is it allows us to create social discourse rather than social violence.
Yeah, a screaming match.
There you go. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. Which, of course, doesn't help and solidifies a sense of isolation that actually isn't real.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. So what, besides the things that we've been talking about just now, do you have any other thoughts on other large obstacles to bodyfulness in our culture?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that a lot of societies oppress the body in general, mm-hmm. and make it less than, or as I was saying before, but I think we all have a tendency over time to absorb ideas about specific bodies that can reduce bodyfulness and create actual violence towards our bodies and the bodies of others. And so we make specific bodies wrong. We make the body of a person who has different skin color than ours wrong. We make their lips or their nose or their hair wrong. We make the way that they move wrong. And we tell stories about these other bodies that are demeaning and degrading. And this, I think, the first way that we really oppress other people and have biases towards other people is that we make their bodies wrong. And so I think this is so critical for us to understand that we all carry bias. We all carry body bias. And it's incumbent on us as part of our bodyfulness practices to really uncover different body biases, whether it's about ageism or sexism or homophobia, that these kinds of body biases are buried pretty deep, and we have a tendency to try to counteract some of the verbal and cognitive biases, but we really need to wake up to the body biases that we often carry and don't realize it.
Yeah. And this is part of a larger question, or a larger concept of bodylessness that you unpacked in the book. Of course, I don't have the other features of it written down here, but perhaps you can recall. Let me see if I can bring it up very quickly, because it's a very interesting chapter. Bodylessness. Okay, here we are. Ignoring the body. Yeah, ignoring the body. Seeing the body as an object or project, hating the body, and then making specific bodies wrong, which is the one that you had just were talking about. Do you want to talk about maybe one other of these four features of this term bodylessness that you unpack?
Yeah, one of the ones, and I didn't coin this term, but just made use of it, is the body as project. And so we see ourselves as that the body is an improvement project. And so we have to go to the gym because we want to look cut, or, six-pack abbed or whatever. You can see body as project in a lot of communities, like the yoga community or the dance communities, and this idea that there's a way that the body should look and operate that is in I think it was first term coined in a feminist theory about the body as a project. So the body is always needing to be used rather than lived in such a way that we appear better for others, or that we feel a certain way and don't feel other ways. And so this can become, of course, really neurotic. I think we're all aware of people in our lives, or even ourselves, that can make ourselves pretty nuts about the body as a project. And we, of course, this is fed by consumer culture. And so we see the body as a commodity in consumer culture, that the body, the amount of the billions of dollars we spend every year in the cosmetics industry and the plastic surgery industry is pretty appalling, actually, in terms of how we start hating our body because it doesn't look the way we've been taught to think that it's supposed to look, or it doesn't operate the way that we want it to operate. It's very controlling, and it's very sort of top down, again, a kind of bullying of the natural states of the body, and a pushing away of our direct experience, and experiences that we need to be a little more vulnerable to. So, for instance, the experience of aging, the experience of weight, the experience of our body's size, the symmetry of the body, or the various abilities or disabilities that we carry in our body, are very important to hold and care for, rather than make wrong.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I feel like, especially with aging, there's, I feel like there are some areas of our culture which have woken up to the kind of, when it comes to the size variations of size of bodies, like there are kind of empowering narratives, but when it comes to aging, we don't really have any empowering narratives of aging. It's pretty much just like, it's all downhill. Whereas, and it seems like it sometimes makes me think about previous cultures that had more of a respect for the elder, right? They held this, like when you were, it was initiation into old age, where you actually took on this new role, and that was supported. Whereas now we don't seem to have that. It's like, as soon as people get older, it's sort of, they disappear. We put them in nursing homes, and they're no longer as represented in kind of the cultural mainstream on TV and movies and whatever. So it's like we lack these sort of narratives of empowerment that would actually support our experience of aging. Yes,
very well put. A very powerful example of how bodylessness can occur and does occur.
Yeah. So,
Uh,
last question is on the last chapter of your book, which is enlightened on the topic of the enlightened body. So, what
mhm.
is the enlightened body, and how do we get there?
Yeah, well, this sort of circles back to my irritation with the word mindfulness,
Yeah.
and it's the idea that it's actually uh, we are really our mind is something that our body does. Our body does like digestion, it does thinking, and it does breathing, and it does all these different things. So our mind is actually something that the body is doing. And so the idea of being awake for me is essentially a bodily experience. And to think of wakefulness as only being in the mind is really actually ass backwards. And so we want to really go with how do we understand and promote a kind of wakefulness, a body wakefulness? And that's what that last chapter is about, or trying to address, is what are the practices and the disciplines that allow us to wake up to our lived experience, our the experience of being here right now in this physical state. This is us. This is me. This is and to understand wakefulness from the perspective of attention into the direct experience of our sensations, our moving body, our relating body, our breathing body, etc. That's sort of a short rendition of that last chapter, and how, for me, it's so critical going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, Christine. Are there any
So,
kind of loose threads based on the conversation we've had today that you'd like to touch on, or any final thoughts?
I think you've been incredibly thorough and thoughtful, and I can't think of a thing. So
Awesome.
I'm really
Well,
happy with this as well. Thank you so much.
yeah, it has been a pretty comprehensive conversation. I feel like we've made it through all the key points, and the book is really great. And I encourage everyone who is listening to get it at your local bookstore or on Amazon. It's again Bodyfulness: Somatic Practices for Presence, Empowerment, and Waking Up in This Life, by my guest Christine Caldwell. Christine, are there any events or anything coming up that you'd like to share in terms of workshops or
Oh,
anything like that?
well, I'm certainly teaching in the Mind Body Certificate program, and that's pretty exciting. We have a new semester coming up in January. I'm going to be the keynote speaker at a dance therapy conference in Chicago in June, and I'll be talking about bodyfulness there. And also, if you want to go to my website to find out about different events and trainings and things like that, you can go to themovingcycle.com.
TheMovingCycle.com. Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Christine. It's been such a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure as well, Jacob. Thanks so much for your thoughtfulness and bodyfulness.